Hello, everyone. Thank you very much for joining me today. So, off the back of my visit to KubeCon in Valencia in April, one of the sessions that I struggled to get into was held by Daniel Bryant, which was called From Kubernetes to Platform as a Service to What's Next. And it really, Daniel's abstract for that session kind of really resonated for me about this evolution of the ecosystem and cloud native and what teams should really be focusing on to drive business value within a customer. So I decided to, well, first and foremost, I couldn't get into the session, so I actually watched that on a live stream whilst at KubeCon, sat on some beanbags. It was actually not a bad way to watch the session. I've actually since watched that session twice back to kind of keep up my crib notes on that and thinking around it. And then I thought, why not get in touch with Daniel, the man himself, to chat about some of these things and actually relate it back to some of the areas I focus on quite a lot, which is the cloud management and focusing on infrastructure and operations as well. So, Daniel, thank you so much for giving me your time today. If you want to do a quick introduction for yourself for those that may not know you.
Yeah, no, thanks for the invite, Dean. Appreciate it. It's always nice to chat to like-minded folks and share the knowledge, and we always evolve together, I think, right, as a community. So more than happy to share my ideas. So my name's Daniel Bryant. I'm currently head of DevRel at Ambassador Labs. My background is quite varied, just say. I've done the developer thing. Like I started my career as a Java developer mainly, front-end script, a Fable stack developer back in the 2000s, right? And I moved into architecture, did a lot of software architecture, some consulting, and eventually into ops. Really fascinated by Linux, by what was a Mesos, and Kubernetes, of course, emerged around like the mid 2010s. I was super interested in that space, and I've done a few CTO gigs as well, so some leadership things, and now I've gone over into the product side. So taking all that knowledge and all that experience I've got from the services and the consulting side, and actually now coming together and trying to help folks really leverage the great new architecture trends we've got in microservices, serverless, function as a service, and that cloud space where Kubernetes adds a lot of awesome stuff, but it also adds some extra challenges in, shall we say, and I think we need to fill the gaps. So I'm super excited, working with the community, and particularly with Ambassador Labs, to build some of the products, open source, commercial, to fill some of those gaps, so that bottom line, developers can just deliver value. Most developers I chat to, they're like, just want to figure out the business idea. I want to code some stuff. I want to test it. I want to ship it to production. I want to see happy users, right? And that's actually harder than it really needs to be in some of the cloud stuff. So my goal is to make it easier for folks to do that.
So first things first then, for most people, I think kind of one of the key points there is Kubernetes is not the answer. It's just part of the jigsaw of a solution then for the developer.
Yeah.
Okay. So with your session that you held, and we'll maybe touch on some of the areas that you've updated your thinking around that particular session as well. So what I really liked, you started off the session by saying, here's the TLDR up front, so there's no surprises. So, you talk about the concept of golden pass, which would be great if you could expand on that in a second as well. And basically kind of one of the theories around that side of it is platform engineering is the key to going forward as well. And I think that idea of platform engineering, if we go back to businesses and how they're implementing new technologies, is really something that's hard to get right, but kind of on paper sounds like the right idea because it matches to buzzwords like DevOps and agile working and so forth.
Yeah.
And you said it yourself as well. We've got this thing where we keep telling these developers to shift left, and we're providing them APIs and tooling. But that actually, again, is the jigsaws as part of the puzzle, but it doesn't complete the puzzle on its own. From my background, I come from operations, so I was building servers manually, then automating them. I was physically racking and stacking things, and I sit there with my infrastructure hat on, and I realize that bringing a lot of this together can be quite complex, and actually it's really easy to be left behind when you don't understand the developer world and what they want to do. When you think about testing and release cycles for software, that's so far away from providing access to storage or a firewall network. So let's break some of those ideas down. So first and foremost, let's start off with the one which I think even for me, I had to kind of quickly start Googling this stuff, was golden paths.
Yeah.
What's that to the layman?
Yeah, it's interesting. So I've been hearing from the kind of unicorns, the FANGs, right? Your Netflixes and your Googles. And we're not all those kind of companies, but I like to look at them as kind of like aspirational, or see what they're doing, kind of, like maybe point us to the future, right? And I bumped into, I think it was the Netflix folks in 2017, a bit before that, at the KubeCon conferences, like, because I help out at InfoQ, write for InfoQ as well. And they were talking a lot about freedom and responsibility. Netflix have always talked about that, right? But they kind of codified this approach to freedom and responsibility in a notion of paved paths, they were calling it, right? And I was like, this is intriguing, right? And it was kind of riding off the back of things like Heroku was super popular. I was doing Ruby on Rails at the time with Heroku as a platform as a service. I was doing work in Cloud Foundry, which again, platform as a service for Java code, Java applications. And it intrigued me. Netflix, freedom and responsibility, but they're looking at things like PaaS, but they're not being as restricted. Or as restrictive, sorry, as PaaS. They recognize the value, and developers mostly want that minimal friction for coding, testing, shipping, and running. It's kind of, in the presentation, I said coding, shipping, running. I think now we're thinking even more about test as well, which is really important. But you want to minimize that friction. That's the key thing with these paved paths, paved roads, golden paths, many sort of names that are quite similar. The fundamental thing is about providing that optimal experience to do the right thing and to do it with as little friction as possible. That's the key thing there. And the Netflix approach with paved paths is very much like there's one way to do the thing, as in if you want to code, test, ship, and run, you can totally do your own thing, but you're on the dirt track, to continue the analogy, right? Paved road, we make it easy for you. There's a bunch of tools that you can use to get started, to skeleton your app, to test it, pushing to prod. They use Spinnaker, a bunch of other things at the time they were using to do rollouts. But Netflix, again, freedom and responsibility. If you want to use Jenkins, or you want to use like some unknown, Rust at the time, sort of unknown or whatever, like D, different languages, you can totally do that, but you're on the dirt track in that you're responsible for figuring out the scaffolding. You're responsible for the testing. You're responsible, if it goes wrong in production, they're going to be calling you, right, on first line support. Whereas the paved path has that support perhaps baked into it, or like SRE type folks that will help you out. And I saw that, to address your question specifically, Dean, I saw the Spotify folks specifically talking about golden paths, and then a bunch of other folks started pulling that apart. I think the one difference, and I've had a few interesting chats with the Luna Bank folks and some other folks on Twitter about this, and some very interesting folks from Google, actually. I've forgotten the person's name, but he actually came and chatted to me at KubeCon. And the one difference we kind of came to see is the paved path is kind of like the one single best practice way to do things, whereas the golden paths, there tends to be more than one. So Spotify in the blog post, if folks look at my KubeCon talk, the links are all included. We can drop them in the show notes, perhaps. If you look at the golden paths of Spotify, there's like a golden path for machine learning applications. There's a golden path for web apps, and there's a golden path for desktop apps in Spotify's world. So like all the principles are the same. They bootstrap the scaffolding, they hook it into CI, to observability, all these good things. But because they had very different, like, heterogeneous workloads or even requirements, right, in terms of ML versus a web app, they recognize there's multiple paths, and they called them golden paths, right? But the principle is fundamentally the same across all the things.
So that's quite interesting, because that's the business realizing. I think I've definitely spent many years helping businesses kind of simplify a lot of complexity that they baked into how they get something into production that provides business value. And again, thinking for an infrastructure world, that's, hey, how do we get a web server out there and connect it to the load balancer and provide better availability? And its simplification basically means get rid of all these complex different things that we're doing and make them all very similar. But as you say, that then does bring its own problems, because there are going to be nuances there. So either you keep those nuances as separate items, and you've still got to manage them, but it's about having that structure around there to do that. So you mentioned quite a few names in there: Heroku, Cloud Foundry, Spinnaker, and so forth, which are all developer-focused tools. So that's developers building software, needs to push that software somewhere, compile it, and then run it somewhere. So obviously sat behind all of that, resources and infrastructure. So maybe you could link that back to this idea of platform engineering is key going forward, and actually maybe talk a little bit about how that affects traditional infrastructure teams that are running bare metal, racking and stacking, setting up networks, storage, looking after virtualization platforms. Yeah,
it's super interesting, Dean. So, and one thing I'd caveat by saying I think there's always a space for folks that just want to rack and stack and do super deep networking stuff. And not only is there space, I think, within many companies, but your hyperclouds, hyperscalers like Amazon, Google, Azure, and many others, VMware, and other folks, right? There's always space in those companies. Like, it's kind of shifting a little bit. Like when I started my career, like we needed experts in every organization because everyone was bare metal back in the day, right? You open the door to like the cupboard and there's a server rack, right? When I worked, my first gig was in the UK government, and we sat as developers next to the server room, right? And we would go in and we'd rack and stack and stuff. So that is still viable, but I think now more and more of us treat that as a commodity, and therefore we look to the Amazons of the world. So if you're really interested or have that skill set and you're worried, I'd say, don't worry, just go and have a chat to the cloud companies, right? They're definitely looking to employ folks in that space. So there's always, change is scary, but I think there's always that sort of out ramp, if you like, that if you are really interested in just the hardware, it's not a problem, right? But I do think it's sort of a general shift in the industry is towards software-defined everything. Right. So like Amazon, and all the clouds, right? I'm picking Amazon because I'm often there first, but like they really revolutionized cloud computing or computing in general through many mechanisms, everything abstracted, API driven, self-service, billing per, second or whatever. But yeah, the key things with platform engineering, the focus on building infrastructure that's sort of more focused towards the delivery of applications, I think it's shifted away from the kind of them and us type approach of the dev and ops, right? As an ops, just build the things, and then developers sort of build stuff on top. I think these days it's focused towards platform engineering, and I think those words, it's tricky with the words sometimes, but the reason I think folks are saying platform engineering rather than infrastructure engineering is the platform kind of comes with some baggage, some things associated with it. Like a platform will help you code, test, ship, and run. Whereas infrastructure, you've got to knit that together to do that. Like I remember when I first started working with Amazon, and we were using, like, say, Puppet to knit things together, and then we'd have to like use Bash to install some stuff on the boxes. And then, once we got our kind of servers right, then we'd like create a Jenkins machine that would link like our repository, like CVS or Git or whatever, and it would build the code, as you said, and then deploy that onto these machines. So it's very much we were putting our own layers, our own abstractions, which now we would call a platform. We were putting that on top of the actual the tin or the VMs at the time. Whereas now I think platform engineering is more about engineers, ops focused engineers, building these systems, these platforms, this infrastructure layer, but very much with the developer as a customer in mind.
Yes.
You know what I mean? And I think back in the day, it was because I did some racking and stacking as well. And the requirements were, to your point, they were exactly like, we just need a server that can run Apache, web server on it, right? And it's like, cool, we know the rough spec, RAM, CPU, chuck it in, good to go. Whereas I think requirements these days are skewing more towards, I've got this workload, I want to run it. Do you know what I mean? That's kind of that was the Heroku thing. When I was doing Ruby on Rails, it was a dream, right? As in literally, it was just like Heroku push, and you just, your code base was pushed up to Heroku, and it was magically running in a dyno in a VM effectively, and then you could expose it via an endpoint or out. And as a developer, that's frictionless, right? I had my code, I did my push, and then it appeared, and I was like, wow, I didn't need to know anything about Jenkins. I didn't need to build like boxes with Puppet or whatever, right? I was just like doing my thing. So, and to your point, there was obvious trade-offs there. Like, you couldn't always sort of open the hood or look behind the curtains or whatever analogy you want to use. You kind of had to go with what Heroku gave you, and like that's the rise of the 12-factor app and all that kind of stuff. Like, and I remember when I was doing some app engine work on Google, like even they offered sort of like JVM as a service, but the way the Java virtual machine, but the way you use that Java virtual machine was restricted. I remember you couldn't do certain things with the file system, all that kind of stuff. And as a developer, I was a bit like, huh? But now as an operator, I get it, right? As in they were deliberately sandboxing what I could do, which made sense because it made it operationally easier for them to do that. So yeah, lots of things to unpack there. But I think that's for me.
There's actually there's two things that come to mind as you say. There's a lot of things to unpack there. So the first one, which I think is really key, is this, as you say, that move towards a platform, which is the ops teams looking at everything that they provide back to a developer. Actually, you can touch that again in your talk, and I've heard it in other podcasts and videos, stuff like that. Actually, it's this productization of the platform itself, because the developer, basically, the value is then building the code, which then is pushed and compiled and then made available to the consumer, whether that's an end customer that brings revenue into the business, or maybe it's for productivity reasons internally within the business. But to do that, essentially, Heroku productized the underlying fundamentals, which is how do I get access to networking, storage, compute capacity. And that's what a platform team I see is doing now, is we're productizing all of these services. And yes, we need something to broker them. And Kubernetes, I was speaking to Joe Bader a while ago about this, who's one of the founders of Kubernetes. Basically, Kubernetes isn't the endpoint or the answer from that. And again, I'm kind of putting this into my words, not his. But he was saying Kubernetes is that API gateway to broker all of those disparate services together, because it makes it then easier to productize for then when you push that code, which I think is really important. The next piece, and I think you just started to touch on it, you then obviously have some trade-offs. So to consume the product, like any product out there in the world that you consume, there's always going to be a trade-off. I wish it did X, I wish it did Y, or I don't have the ability to do Z. But then that gives control back to the platform engineering team. So some of that operational control you lose because your value is building code. But then the platform team can then start to focus on other value areas, such as how do they implement security scanning, security rule sets and baseline, because they've got that level of control, which is what you described with the Google example there with the Java virtual machine. You can't change the file system, but I'm damn sure that file system was controlled by a central policy system, compliance, whatever it may be at Google, behind the scenes as well, because that control is kept by the platform owner or the product owner.
Yeah, very much so, Dean. Yeah, 100% agree. And I think probably where we're going with this is it's easier to deal with products when you're consuming them as a service, right? Like Heroku kind of came with that, those trade-offs pretty front and center on their website. And then particularly the 12-factor app that kind of emerged, that architecture style was like, at the time, was like revolutionary, and it arguably helped a lot with microservices. Google, same deal, right? They're very clear with App Engine. I think where we're heading on this one, though, is it's tricky for particularly ops-minded folks, and I put myself in that in back in the day, to think about what they're offering as a product. Does that make sense? Like offering like the whole, like you mentioned, like storage, networking, compute. Like I definitely worked with a bunch of companies that were putting platforms, what I would call platforms, together now, but they were very much the anti-pattern I was seeing when I was consulting in London. I won't name any names for obvious reasons, but when I was consulting in London, we go in and as consultants, you obviously see bad things happening. That's kind of why you're brought in quite a lot of the time, right? But the ones that were going a bit wrong was they were literally copying Amazon at the time. And I deliberately pick on Amazon there, because that was like, I'd go in and ask, I say, so what are you building? And they go, oh, we're trying to do our own internal Amazon. We've invested, millions, billions, or whatever in this tin. We've got to use it, right? And it's like sunk cost fallacy front and center, but there we go. And I was like, so have you talked to developers? And they most of the time was like, no, we'll just offer what Amazon offers, right? Because Amazon were the leader at the time, and that kind of thing. But yeah, that's very different, right? You're offering literally those three things: compute, networking, storage, as a product. To your point about the trade-offs, like, does the average developer think in compute, memory, storage, networking? Not really. They're typically higher abstractions, right? They might be thinking, they recognize that they can only load so much into memory, and they recognize there's only so many threads available on the OS, depending on the level of sort of experience of the developer. But that's a massive mindset shift for a lot of ops folks, right? To think about it is abstractions. Often it's core abstractions, right? How do you expose those primitives, or some sort of insight into the primitives we've talked about, but in a way that developers understand and can work with? Do you know what I mean? I think that's one of the biggest shifts here. Like, again, if you buy a product or pay for a service as a service product, it's implicit, right? You got to go along with the contract. But when you start building it yourselves, as you and I, I'm sure, have seen, that suddenly, like, if you haven't got that product mindset, and to be honest, it took me a while to get, and I'm still learning now. If you haven't got that, you'll just copy someone else or go too low level, as my experience with the products you're actually offering to developers. So that is, I think, a big area where we still have a lot of room to develop particularly in the Kubernetes space, probably the cloud space too as well, but definitely in the Kubernetes space. To your point, where you were saying, like Joe Bader was saying, like I've heard Kelsey Hightower mention, like Kubernetes is a platform for platform builders. Does that make sense? Like,
Yes.
it's not a platform for developers. And when Kelsey said, Kelsey's always on point, right? And I was like, oh, I get it, Kelsey. Like, and you said it yourself, Dean, it's a component within your platform. And too many folks I chat to, particularly a few years ago, less so now, but they thought Kubernetes was a PaaS. They were like, oh, I'm going to adopt Kubernetes. Where's the CI in this? Oh, how do I do observability? Like, there's not even an API gateway included. Like, hence, Ambassador Labs are focusing on emissary ingress and edge stack as an API gateway to get traffic into your back end, because it doesn't come by default in upstream Kubernetes, right? Open source. And folks are like, oh, so it's just a component within the platform. That's it. Like, you've got to layer on
It's
stuff.
another piece of the jigsaw, right? It's not the complete jigsaw together.
100%.
So if we move on, so part of your talk focused around kind of three main areas, which is what are the core app developer platform requirements, which is around code, ship, and run, which obviously are very developer focused words, but maybe you could break those three areas back down as well about how they relate back to, again, platform engineering, teams that need to offer these resources and productize it within their business.
Yeah, it's super interesting. So for me, like, the coding is all about that business problem, getting fast feedback, particularly when you're containerizing things and then deploying them as part of this bigger microservice app that adds some extra challenges in. Now, you've really got to think about encapsulation, information hiding, cohesion coupling as a developer, right? You always got to think about that, but microservices made it a bit more challenging because now you've got this like hard network boundary that you're exposing functionality with an API. So it's very easy to build the distributed monolith, right? And then like, how do you physically develop that? Like, if you need to spin up all the microservices on your local machine, like we're seeing a lot of folks now into remote development, and we do a tool, telepresence, we donated to the CNCF that helps folks connect up their local machine to a remote machine. So you can kind of share the resources, right? So like locally, you can still have your tooling, play around, debug, test. But if you need to call out to dependencies in the cloud, you can do that, right? And there's many tools, telepresence, CNCF project, sort of network syncing, there's Scaffold from the Google folks, more file syncing based. There's many open source tools out there that help you do this. But the fundamental thing with the coding space in the cloud is getting fast feedback as a developer. We were used to, like, back in the day when I started coding Java, I lived in, I think it was Oracle JDev at the time, like, or my IDE. I was into test-driven development, so it was red, green, refactor, and my dependencies were local. So I mocked a few things, stubbed a few things, but as I went through my career, I recognized, with the rise of microservices and other things, there was just more stuff that I had to mock, stub, virtualize, start, connecting up, like doing port forwards, all that kind of stuff. So fast feedback is key, and there's a few extra sort of things to think about when you start containerizing and using things like Kubernetes. And then the ship aspect is all about getting stuff into production and thinking about the separation of deployment and release. So that is one really cool thing. I think Kubernetes is really like jammed home for folks, and that you can deploy and not release. You can deploy multiple versions of your app in production, say, or in any environment, but then it can be a business decision when you release. And not only is it a business decision when you release, but you can do cool things like canarying, all that kind of stuff, right? Where you divert like a percentage of traffic through to these new services to test it on a business level, kind of KPIs. You can test it on a infrastructure level, SLIs, like, is this new algorithm you got going to blow up your cluster? Well, let's only reroute 1% of traffic, right, to this canary. And if the canary looks good, 5% traffic, 10%, up to 100%, that kind of thing. So shipping for us is a lot about, Mike, we're talking about GitOps, a lot of that sort of codifying, a lot of best practices around that. But it's about making it easy for developers to say, hey, I want to put this thing in production, and here's how we should approach it.
Okay, everyone. So it's probably coming up to the end of your coffee break now, listening to me and Daniel chat. So I've cut this interview in half. So the next 25 minutes or so are going to be as part 2. And you can either follow that up straight away on YouTube, on my channel, or you can quick link to it at theeducate.co.uk/what's-next-p2. See you soon.